I'm Dory Trotek. Today is Wednesday, October 13th, 2004, and we are interviewing Albert Goldberg. Al, tell us first what your complete name is.
It's Albert Joseph Goldberg.
And you have a nickname that everyone knows you.
I'm one of about three Yossies in the city.
Tell us a little bit about where you were born, what your childhood was like in
Well,
Milwaukee.
I was born in Milwaukee, Wisconsin.
When?
In 1920, September 30th, 1920. I was one of eight siblings, 6 boys and 2 girls. Parenthetically, my mother was part of 6 boys and 3 girls. My father family was 6 boys and 3 girls. How it happened, I don't know.
What was it like? Where did you live when you grew up?
All right. I was essentially a Latin Park person, which means the area around Latin Park, going down to maybe Galena Street, north to North Avenue, east to 2nd Street, and west to Fond du Lac Avenue, in that area.
Was it a very Jewish neighborhood?
It was the Jewish neighborhood until it flopped over into black. But like all the rest of the kids in that neighborhood, you went to Cheder. You got, in my case, not such a good Jewish education or Hebrew education, but every day after school, you went to Cheder. That's all there was to it. My childhood, I would say, was very sheltered. I was a nice little boy, I guess, I don't know. And as I grew up, I became a newsboy like every other guy in the neighborhood. I joined the various youth organizations, AZA, mainly AZA. I was a leader in AZA. I was president of AZA. I went to their national conventions. After AZA, I became active in the JCC and the Jewish Family Service. I was very active in the Jewish Family Service. I was not a good athlete. I hate to admit it, but I was a terrible athlete. I think that gives you an overview of...
Al, tell us a little bit about your parents. Where were they born and when did they come?
My father was born in a place called, we called it Balbirishok. I could look it up, it isn't spelled that way, in Lithuania. He was born on August 10th, 1882.
And he came here when?
He came here, I would say, in about 1906 from England. The family name in Lithuania, we think, well, we don't know what it really was. It could have been
Goldberg.
Kaznansky. But my niece Barbara, whatever, has traced it, and he says it was not Kaznansky, it actually was Goldberg.
Huh.
So we don't know what it really was. In any event, about the turn of the century, my father, like everybody else, Jewish men, ran out. They didn't want to get into the Russian army. He ran to England, and there he took the name Gunther. And I'll never know why he changed it, because Gunther would be such a better name if you're running for office or something. But when he came to America, Goldberg was like being a Rothschild or something. It was such a wonderful name. So he came to find all his brothers had become Goldbergs, except one brother went to Florida. He became a Gilbert. Now my mother was born in what is now Finland. Then it was Russia. When she was 2 years old, her family, which was Padways, they went to England when she was 2 years old. Now, we don't know how they became Padways. The story is they came from Padua, Italy, probably apocryphal. But they were part of the Katzenelnbogen family. Now, the Katzenelnbogen is like talking about the elite, the leaders of the Ashkenazi part of East Europe. Okay? And there are still Katzenelnbogens all over the world. I read about one in Chicago. It amazed me. But she was part of the Katzenelnbogens.
How did they get to this country?
Well, she married my father in, I don't know, like...
In England?
In England, in 1906. Later, I'll mention I.E. Goldberg, Oliver Scholem. He was born there after they got married, of course. And then they came here in about 1906. I'm guessing when I say that. But that's when he became a Goldberg, see.
Talk a little more about your father.
Well, my father was probably the leader of the immigrant Jewish community in Milwaukee. Probably the man that held the whole community together. When he came over, he helped organize what was called the Independent Jewish Fruit Peddlers Union. Independent Fruit Peddlers.
And about when was this? What years are we talking about?
Well, let's see. I've got notes here. About 1917. Maybe it was before that. But he became president of that organization until 1947. Now, I said it was Independent Fruit Peddlers Union because all these new immigrants that came over, they just peddled. They peddled fruit. They peddled something, junk or whatever. But they were peddlers. But as they became more affluent, they became grocers. So now they had to change the name to Independent Fruit Dealers Union. And all that time, here was Louis Goldberg holding the community together. Why do I say that? Because Independent Fruit Dealers Union, forget it. A union is employees of an employer. Every one of these men was a self-employed. Starting out with a push cart maybe, and eventually getting a horse and wagon, and eventually getting a truck, and if he was affluent enough, opening a grocery store, or other business. By the way, my father, when he came over, was a picture framer. That's what he learned in England. But he soon, that was nothing for a Jewish man in Milwaukee to make a living. The other people wouldn't bring their pictures to be framed. Anyway, my father saw that no Jewish immigrant lived in poverty in Milwaukee. The union really was a loan organization. And those who had the money would pay into the loan organization. And then they would make loans to these immigrants, see? Now, these immigrants, it was a loan at no interest. Maybe they would pay it back. Maybe they wouldn't. They weren't required to pay it back. They were never hounded for it. No one went hungry in my father's regime. Many a time, some poor family would get up in the morning and find a box of food on their doorstep. Louis Goldberg had put it there. When Pesach came, he and Rabbi Schoenfeld got together the money for, what do you call it? I forget what it's called in Yiddish. But those two men would see that everybody had the money for a Seder. See? They didn't have to pay it back. Maybe he and the rabbi would go out and collect money for some poor family and give it to them, but not tell them who gave it. It was their right to have it. That was Louis Goldberg, see. And he was that until 1947. Now, as I say, I don't think he started with a push cart. Maybe he did. But he then graduated a horse and wagon, and from that, a truck, and eventually in 1935, he opened a commission house, produce. Now you can imagine, any guy who couldn't afford to pay for his produce, he was on the cuff, and he wouldn't go after them. No way would he go after them. So that was his role in the community. He held the immigrant Jewish community together. Don't forget this. He went to England, so he knew how to speak English. Many of these men came over, they didn't know from any English to begin with. So he became their nexus to the English-speaking community. So he became the leader because he could speak English.
Well, what was your mother like? How did
All right, now, my mother
I want to ask you to put
was
the
a
paper
very
down.
motherly person. I say that advisedly. A person that at any time of the day had 3 different kinds of soups on the stove. At any time of day you could come in and be fed. Okay? To the point where we had our house led back to Lapham Park, and we were the only walkway back to the fence.
Put the paper down.
Back to the fence that led to the park. Kids would walk through and go to the park. They never got walking through. They went through the house. She fed them and then took them out to the park. On a hot day, she'd make iced tea, something else, and bring it out to the park so that she didn't want them being thirsty. They were not to be thirsty, see? We got the first radio in the neighborhood across the showbox, I think it was called. You'd walk in and here'd be a dozen people sitting listening to this radio. This is our home life, see?
Was it in any way, to what extent was it a Jewish home? Were they observant? Any?
Oh, very observant. Which brings me back to my father. Not only was he president of that union, he became the president of Agudas Achim, which is the Polish show. The time came, and the women sat upstairs, of course. You know, that's how observant it was, how orthodox. Time came when the inspector says, we're going to tear this place down. It's a fire trap. And there's no fire escape for those women up there. So my father single-handedly took that place over and made it habitable and put a fire escape up there for these women. See? So when it came to observance, he was president of the temple, see. Now, later on, of course, Agudas Achim went to the west side. My mother was first a member of the one on 11th and Black North, Resort. And then she went to Beth Israel, but my father was still in Agudas Achim. But until she did that, she was member, maybe president of the auxiliary, women's auxiliary at Agudas Achim. My father, you know Rabbi Feldman? My father brought him over, which meant that he had to pledge that for 5 years that man would not become a public charge. But the man had no real skills. So what did he do? The temple now had a rabbi, Rabbi Feldman. See? And this is the way he did things.
How did you
What?
how did you feel about being Jewish and part of this whole thing as a boy?
I didn't mind. I didn't run up against anti-Semitism.
You didn't.
As I grew older and went to junior high, one of my best friends was a black fella who later became a gangster, see? But that was my best friend. See? And we had black people all over. All over. Our house, back house we rented was black. The house next to us was black. And we didn't feel any threatened. Across the street, a from us was the Fields family, black. They were the hoi polloi of the black. Now, in those days, no black entertainer could get into a hotel. They were barred. So Duke Ellington, you name them, they stayed across the street from us. My sister Jeanette would go over and dance with Duke Ellington or whomever, see. That's how our relationship was with that community. So we never felt threatened, never.
So move along now. Talk a little about high school and where you went to college and your law degree. As you grew older.
Did I tell you about Naomi? All right,
You haven't met her yet.
We'll get to Naomi.
Okay.
I started at 9th Street School, which was right across the street from the playground and whatever that was. I can't remember. But after 6th grade there, then what we call junior high school at Roosevelt Junior High School, and then North Division for my high school years. Now, at junior high school, I was active in some of the organizations there. Tell you the truth, I wasn't active in high school because I had a paper route. I had 2 paper routes. I delivered the forwards in the morning.
Oh.
You recognize the forwards?
Oh, sure.
And the Wisconsin News in the afternoon. So I had no time to do anything. And as I said, I was a lousy athlete, so it didn't make any difference.
But you went on to college, though.
Then I went on to college. First to State Teachers College. I went there from 1937, 1939. And then I knew I wanted to go to law school eventually. I didn't want to become a teacher. So then I transferred to Marquette. And I went 2 years undergrad. And then I went into law school in 1941, I think.
At Marquette?
At Marquette. But here comes the war, see. So only finished a year and a half at Marquette before I enlisted in the Army. You hear that, enlisted? Uncle Sam was breathing hard. He was breathing hard to me. So I enlisted. 26 guys, all enlisted, quote, at the same time, in the Air Corps. See, it was safe. And in the Air Corps, I served as what we call the chairborne. Not airborne, chairborne, and I had an office job. So that was my Army career was until 1945, I think, 45 or 46. Then I came out and went back into law school and graduated and became a lawyer.
And then when did you meet your wife? And tell us about
All right.
her and your family.
You know Naomi.
I know her well.
Naomi, I met her in 1937, I think, when I was at college. And she was at she was at Marquette. And I was at UWM. Now she goes to UWM, and I go to Marquette. But inevitably, if I was at an AZA or whatever, you're going to meet someone at their dances. Her picture's out in the hall there somewhere. So I met her in about 1937, 38. And I went with her until I went in the Army. Now I'll tell you, what we got married, but if the war hadn't come along, we'd still be going together. See? But the war came along, and I was stationed in Texas, and she came back down to see me. I.E. Oliver Schoen, the senior in the family, says to her, "No decent girl goes down to see a man unless she's married to him." I had to get married in 1942. It was in December 23rd, 1942. Now, I'm living with her in Texas for a year. I come home on furlough. My mother says, no marriage, Jewish marriage, is valid without a religious marriage.
Right.
Right? So we had to get married on my furlough, see. So you're listening on the phone, and I hear my mother saying to someone on the phone, my son and my daughter-in-law are they're getting married. It's my daughter-in-law, but they're getting married. They had to be. There was no other way about it. So that's Naomi, and we had 2 children, Peggy and Peter. Everybody knows Peter. Peter Goldberg, you know Peter? You're only one doesn't. So Peggy went to Detroit. She went to Michigan State. Peter went to Harvard. And he got out and he went in the Peace Corps for 2 years. When he came back, he dropped out of the Peace Corps. It wasn't. So he decided he wanted to be a rabbi, see? So he went to Rabbi Weinberg. And he says, I want to be a rabbi. Rabbi Weinberg says, you know, the new class at Reform, wherever in Cincinnati, wherever it is, it starts next week. He says, well, I want to be a rabbi. He said, I'll get you in. Now, the first year of the Reform school, whatever, is in Israel, because their idea is that they get a grounding in archaeology, and they'd understand their Jewish and Hebrew roots. Well, I hate to say this, but he and about 20 other guys dropped out of the school.
Hebrew Union College it is.
Yes, because he said, if those guys teaching us, if they're going to be rabbis, or they're going to be practicing rabbis, not for me. So he dropped out. Came home and went to law school. He came out.
At this point, you had you started your law practice, right?
Yeah, after
After you came back.
1947.
Yeah. So talk a little about your law practice.
Well, I went into the firm of Padway and Goldberg. No, Padway, Prevent, Goldberg and Prevent. Padway, Goldberg and Prevent. And as a junior, I did all the dirty work, running up to court with papers and all that. But eventually, now our firm was 50% labor law, which anybody will recognize, and 50% general practice, including personal injury. And I went into the personal injury end of it and became, I would say, prominent as a products liability and malpractice attorney. What did Bush say about that malpractice attorney? Anyway, that was my career. But the firm was famous for its representation of labor. Anybody will recognize the name of Joe Padway, and I could get that later, how the firm actually started. But Joe Padway was hired as the attorney for the union, AFL unions, not AFL-CIO, AFL unions in the Milwaukee area, which included the building trades, the mine workers, anything that was AFL. Eventually became the state representative of the AFL, and my brother I.E. Oliver Shulman was supposed to take it over. He was killed in an airplane accident in 1947. So my brother, A.G., then became the state counsel and all that. A.G. did not like living in Washington, which that would have required. So he turned it over to Dave Prevent. But he still represented the state unions, AFL unions, which I eventually took over because he didn't like going to meetings and things like that. And he was a big father figure. Anybody with a problem, I'll tell you, this state and city avoided more labor conflict because of A.G. Goldberg. He wouldn't let it get that far. He called the labor unions in council how they were going to stay out of trouble, which they did. Now, that's where it was in my career. Later, you may want to know about the firm itself.
Did Do you remember any particular cases that were sort of outstanding that you had a hand in or that you knew about that were especially interesting to us? Or were they all just so great?
I don't know. I really can't.
Okay.
But if you want to know about the firm, or is that for later?
No, go ahead.
Well, the firm was started by Joseph A. Padway in about, I'd say 1912 or so, thereabouts. At that time, the center of the Jewish community, this immigrant community, was Walnut Street. See, that was the Broadway, or whatever you want to call it, of the Jewish immigrant community. So Joe Padway opened on Walnut Street. An attorney by the name of Emil Hirsch started on Walnut Street. Maury Stern, Bob Hess, my other uncle, I.B. Padway, who never came into the firm, Ben Z. Glass, who became Mr. B'nai B'rith in Milwaukee eventually, and Ben Saltzstein. They were all in that milieu, and they all eventually transferred to downtown. Didn't become, I don't think any of them became partners. I think they may have had firms they started, but they didn't.
Stern and Hirsch was a partnership.
It was? Well,
yeah.
There you are. Now, eventually, Joe Padway decided to, well, it happened eventually because I.E. Goldberg, my brother, in 1927 became an attorney. And then 2 years later, Alfred, my mother ran out of names. Alfred, she ran out of names. So Alfred Goldberg's taken in 2 years later. They had a Gentile, I asked my wife what his name was. She just couldn't give me the name, I can't remember. But essentially it was a Jewish affair. Except there was a judge in Milwaukee, Heading. Remember, well, Jim Heading was his son. He came into the firm also. There wasn't much Gentile, at that time, wasn't much Gentile representation. And eventually Jim went out on his own. So that's how the firm developed. And as I say, we became the dominant labor attorneys in the AFL, and not CIO. CIO was different. CIO had another Jewish attorney. Why can't I remember his name? He was so prominent. He became a judge too. Well, that'll come later. So that was the
beginning of the firm.
Yeah.
And it developed, and the firm exists today.
The firm exists today. Taken in was Richard Goldberg, Danny Goldberg, all the other Goldbergs. There's not a Goldberg in the firm right now.
Oh.
Danny is out on his own. And
are they still doing labor law?
yeah, mainly about 50-50 labor law and general practice, same thing. Mm-hmm. And eventually, AFL-CIO combined. So they started representing a number of AFL-CIO. The interesting thing was we represented the mine workers. That was, I can't remember the president, but a very, very staunch and strong labor leader. We came to represent them too.
Are you talking about mine workers in Wisconsin?
Nationally.
Nationally?
Yeah, because they became part of AFL-CIO, which means there was exposure.
Coal miners.
Yeah, yeah. So,
okay. So it's been a fascinating career for you all these years. So now that you're retired, are you?
I retired in 1990 and a half or something.
And
I'll tell you why.
Okay.
As a personal injury attorney, it's stressful. You're always trying cases or preparing for trying cases. You're always waking up at 3 o'clock in the morning. Did they serve those papers? Did I make this motion I have to make, and I got sick of it. I just couldn't take it anymore, so I retired.
And what have you been doing the last 10 years?
Taking care of my wife. No, it's you build up a coterie of acquaintances. Every Monday there's a family luncheon, and then we go do things together. Every Tuesday there are 12 of us meet for lunch, and then we bust off and do everything. Every Saturday we have a Saturday eating club. So I've got a broad acquaintanceship, and we do things together. Every other week I play poker and lose. So, but it keeps me busy.
Let's go back just a little bit. What kind of a Jewish upbringing did you and Naomi provide for your children?
Well, Naomi was essentially in a Reformed temple. She and her family belonged to Emmanuel since she was 4 years old, and has stayed with Emmanuel staunchly. My brother, Aiel Shalom, I keep saying Shalom because he was killed. Mainly the rest are all dead also, but he was killed in the airplane accident. So you always think I have an Oliver Shalom. He married a, what would you call, a Jewish family that's not very Jewish, you know.
Okay.
So he, early on, went to Emmanuel. After I started going with Naomi, I eventually became Emmanuel. And I've stayed with Emmanuel ever since.
What about your children?
Peter started out Emmanuel, and he now is with Shur Hadash. You know what that is?
Mm-hmm. That's the Reconstruction.
Reconstruction.
Yeah.
So.
And Peggy?
And who, Peggy? Peggy? Not very staunchly Jewish.
Well, what did they went to Sunday school as kids, I assume?
Yeah, they did go to Emmanuel. Both of them went through whatever that is, not bat mitzvah or bat.
Confirmation?
Confirmation. Peter was probably the second person who went through, eluding me, he became bar mitzvah, probably the second one at Emmanuel. I'll give you a little side, the clash of the old families, old Jewish family, and the modern Jewish family. My son was going to be bar mitzvah, right? So my father says, in that church, okay. And my brother, brother Fred says, listen, you're not going to do that to Yossi. You're going to go to that bar mitzvah. That's all there is to it. He says, I'm not going up on the bima. Okay. So he gets there, and so help me, he picked out every crack in the ceiling of Emmanuel walking around. So you can see the clash of the really old Jewish families and their children. And ours wasn't atypical. This was typical of the descendants of these people that came from immigrants. I'll tell you another. Throughout Wisconsin, I don't know if it concerns your historical society.
Don't worry.
But throughout Wisconsin, you got prominent Jewish families in Sheboygan, and you name it. And how did they get there? They got there because they did, like they peddled fruit up there. In winter, they went to pick up metal and traded fruit for it. And eventually, they had junkyards in those places. So a lot of Jewish families are scattered in small Wisconsin towns because of this practice. Now, my father was no different. He went to an area that's called Ashapun. That's up near Beaver Lake in that area. And Henry Neitzel was the banker in that town. And Henry Neitzel said, Louis, You got to open a junkyard in this town and settle here. My grandfather, Abraham Padway, said, Lebke, label, Lebke, your children won't be brought up Jewish. They won't go to Hebrew school. You can't live there. So we became Milwaukeeans. I mean, it again illustrates how the immigrants fared in Wisconsin.
Does that bring you to have any thoughts about the future of the Jewish community here? I mean, you've had experience with a couple generations now.
If you look to my son, there's a wonderful future. If you look to my daughter in Denver, in Detroit, there's a lousy future. And I really can't predict what's going to happen. Temple Sholem, powerful. Temple Emmanuel, they've got to do something to raise their membership. They haven't got enough young people taking over. Sinai, very good. But two of those, they're reform, I think.
Three of those.
Huh?
Those are all three reform.
Yeah. On the other, Bethel, I understand it's from Sewers. So I don't know. I don't know what the future is.
Are there any particular lessons you think you've learned from your life and work? Do you have any little mottos you live by or that you can pass
Well,
on?
the same motto my father. I believe you've got to be strong in charity. The charities I give to fill 3 pages, legal size pages of various charities I give to. I'm more than tithe, I'm sure of that. But I got that from my father. And my mother, my mother. Someone would knock on the door, Mrs., I'm hungry, come on in. Okay? And she'd feed them.
Tell me, how do you think you would like to be remembered in this community?
I'd like to be remembered as a friend of everybody. And I think I am considered a friend of everybody. I think enough people know me as an amiable person. Amiable person. And really, that's what I want to be remembered as. Okay. I'm still active in some organizations, but not a leader. My last thing I was a leader in was family service. See, but I volunteer. I'm a volunteer at Sinai Samaritan Hospital.
Mm-hmm. What do you do there?
I conduct a reception room for people who have relatives in surgery. I see they get refreshments. I check up on the ones who are in surgery. I figure out after about 3 hours they should be through with surgery. So I call surgical care and I find out the status of that person. Then I report it to the relative. Then that person is going to go into recovery. And I know that in about a half hour that person is going to be assigned a room on the 4th floor. So I call up recovery and I find out the number of room. Then I take these people who could stay in the reception room and I move them up to the 4th floor. It doesn't seem like a lot, but to these people, you give them something firm to grab hold of.
Great. Is there anything else you want to talk about that we didn't touch on?
Well, if you got any questions?
Well, I think I asked all my questions, but you always have thoughts. Anything in your notes you didn't get a chance to tell us about?
One thing that impresses me and why I worry about the Jewish community, I walked down that hall and saw the YMHA dancing, AZA dancing. I'm appalled at how many of those people aren't living today. It just appalls me, and that reflects me on the future of the Jewish community. I don't know what to make of it. But we'll live. A lot of people are still going to Israel in spite of being somewhat afraid. But they're going. I went. Well, that was before the trouble. I went there. But we'll survive.
From your
I'm
mouth to
appalled by
God's ear.
some of what's happening with Israel, but we'll survive.
Al, thank you so very much for participating in the oral history that the Federation is doing. We
Are
really
we off?
appreciate it very much.